Hello and welcome to the Sexient Being Sessions. Today we're talking about alone. And to me, this is the concept, one that can both be very scary for many people and also very fulfilling. So we're going to talk about it in both spectrums and some of my personal journey I've gone through in what it means to be alone. Hi, I'm Alix Pruett. I'm a certified sex, love, and relationship coach with a focus on the BDSM and kink community. I work with men and women, along with couples plus, who want to transform their old patterns, pain, and beliefs so they can create thriving relationships that are deeply connected, playful, and fulfilling within themselves and with others. So, on this topic of alone, as I mentioned as we were doing the intro, um, this can be an idea that is really scary for people, that feeling of being alone, being connected with loneliness. And there's actually been studies done that talk about how being alone is actually more detrimental to your health than being in a relationship. There's actually a lot of research that has gone in around this area, and I don't have the numbers in front of me or the study names, but if you search the subject, you can find these things fairly easily. One of the other pieces of this study that don't get talked about as much, or it only gets talked about once you start getting into relationship studies more particularly, is that it's actually healthier to be alone than to be in stressful relationships. So let's say you are alone and like happy in your aloneness, right? You are content in being solo and being an individual on your own versus being in a bad marriage that's high conflict, high tension, high stress regularly, then you're actually going to be healthier being alone than in the marriage. If you are in a happy marriage or partnership, you actually have a higher satiation in your life than if you were living alone. So just keep those things in mind. There is always gives and takes to each dynamic. If something is causing you a high level of stress in your life, to me, that's the point to look at, right? That's the fear point, the contention point, the thing that's causing an issue that's no longer serving you to then be worked with and to start diving into a little bit more. So there can be a lot of things that come up for individuals around the idea of being alone and it relating to loneliness, right? And that can create anxiety, it can lead to depression, it can lead to self esteem issues, especially when we're comparing ourselves with other people and other situations around us. Um, Again, the same thing can happen when you are in a relationship that actually isn't healthy or isn't serving your needs, right? If you're in toxic dynamics with another person. I was one of those people who I would end up being scared of being alone. Like I knew this was a pattern for myself, but I kept just diving into new relationship after new relationship, time and time again, without ever really taking the time to reflect for myself in between relationships. One of the interesting patterns I noticed, though, is especially at the points between being in between long term relationships, when I was alone or I was single, I actually would get to these points where I was really thriving for myself. And I ended up figuring out that I do really well when I'm alone because I'm not really worried about having to meet everybody else's needs and not taking on this over responsibility in my relationships. I'm not putting other people's needs above mine. If I decide, hey, I have the day off and I want to go drive to the beach, I will just do that thing because the beach is calling me and there is something in it for me to go do, to experience, to have. And honestly, there's many times that I've gone on beach trips and I would rather just be there solo. I enjoy that space. It's fulfilling for me and it really helps me ground into who I am. Like, for whatever reason, the beach is my space of just feeling me no matter what I have coming up in my external life. Um, One thing I ended up doing a few years back, and I am so grateful for having done this for my own experience, was I got really fascinated by shamanic work and came across a book. I think it was called The Cave and the Cosmos, but they referenced shamanic cave journeys. And in this instance, it was physically going and sitting in a cave alone in the dark. And they outlined kind of like what some of the people's experiences had been going through this process. Now, I do want to say, if you don't have access to a cave, you don't have to do this with a physical cave. I did it with a physical cave because I got that opportunity and I had that knowledge base, but it was a really phenomenal and almost, it was very life-changing experience for me, um, because it pushed so many edges, and at the same time, like, I had created enough of a container of safety for me to go through this journey on my own and come out the other side of it. Well, in that process, I had known that when I was a little kid, I had this fear of being alone in the dark. And so so and I went and I sat, or I actually like went and I created a ritual out of the space. I descended down into the cave and sat there, or I walked down through this dark cave on my own. I had been through before with a guide who pointed out the hazard areas of the space and gotten somewhat familiar with it. Like, you can only get so familiar with a big black cave with so much experience of walking through it one time. Um, but I slowly walked through the space and I kind of let myself feel my nervousness, my anxiety that was coming up as I moved through the space. And eventually, I remember like while I was walking, I had this idea of like, well, wherever I find to sit down, I'm gonna like sit against a wall because like I at least then I'll feel the earth supporting me. I'll feel the cave supporting me and like behind my back, and then nothing can come up behind my back. Keep in mind, I'm literally going down in this big, like quarter-mile long cave to sit by myself and be alone in the dark. And I eventually found a spot to sit that was right in the middle of the cave. So no support on my back, but it was one of the few flat spots that existed. So I wasn't sitting on rough lava ground. And that was the spot that called me. There was definitely a high level of anxiety in me wanting to turn off the light and getting to that point. And so I sat there with it. I sat there and I breathed and I felt for when that moment was right. And I eventually turned off all the lights I had with me. Obviously, I had lights in my hand, right? I had a headlamp on my head that I knew I could turn back on at any point in time. But the point was to let myself sit there with this fear, this anxiety of literally being alone in the dark. There were safety measures on hand. There were people that knew. that I was down in this cave. There was time check-ins set up. If I was not back, I believe it was within an hour of time, then people knew I was in this space and to probably start coming to look for me. They also knew offhand where I would be traveling within this cave. They didn't know where I would be sitting for this journey, but at the same time, like it's not that crazy of a cave system to have found where I was as long as I stayed on the routes that I had laid out that I would be traveling down. Again, safety measures, safety precautions for myself, for the well-being and lack of anxiety for the other people around me as well that happened to be on this trip with me. Um, but I sat there and it was very interesting because the anxiety and nerves were high, probably for 5 to 10 minutes. I will divulge that like I didn't have my watch or my phone like readily available, so I don't know how long time was actually sitting. And when you are in different high states of anxiety and stress or altered states of consciousness, which I was sitting there meditating, then there tends to be different types of time dilation, either where time feels like it passes more quickly or more slowly than it actually is. Um, anyhow, I found it fascinating because at some point, as I just sat there and breathed through this experience and noticing that fear coming up, that tension holding in my body, it relaxed out. And I realized how peaceful it was. For the most part, there was no sounds going on in this cave space. Like I could hear my breath in the cave and I could hear little water drips because there was water that would run down through the substrate and drip to the floors of the cave. And I remember thinking, oh, actually, this is really nice. Like, this is so calm. Actually, when I was an atheist back in high school and didn't believe in anything past uh, life, this is what I imagined death would be like, just this peaceful void of nothing. And I sat there with that for a moment, and then I got to find out I was not actually alone in the cave, not as alone as I thought I was, at least. And there was this big whooshing noise, and it was interesting because there was an intense heat off of it. And it started about a foot in front of my head, moved past my left temple and left side of my head, and about a foot off the back of my head. The whooshing sound and heat stopped, but I felt this ball of heat is the best way I could describe it. Logically, my brain went to there's a fucking bat and it's going to attack my head. I don't know if it was a bat. Again, I could not see. Whatever it was didn't physically touch me. It was also fascinating, again, to feel this mass of heat move that close to my head, along with the sound that it was. It also reminded me of the sound of like when you watch like old Indiana Jones movies where they're like they have a flame lit torch in their hand and they're moving it through the space in front of them and you can hear that whoosh noise that goes along with it. That noise was present. And as soon as I felt that, it sent a shock of fear through my system again. And I realized what I was scared of for all since I was a little kid, it wasn't that space of being alone in the dark. It was a fear of what was going to reach out and touch me when I was alone in the dark. And I found that understanding incredibly fascinating because even just in that idea that I had been so scared of being alone for most of my life, that the fear wasn't actually being alone. It was a fear of what was actually like in the dark with me. was fascinating. And I've discovered more of that in different ways as I've gone through other parts of my journey as well. Kind of to conclude out what that cave journey looked like, um, at some point, like I didn't turn on my light, even with the big whooshing noise and fireball sensation moving past my head. Um, I continued to sit there and I focused on calming my breath. Again, I got this like image in my head of like a bat flying by and getting tangled in my hair, and I was kind of freaked out about that. Then, for some reason, I got scared about a bear coming down the right side of the cave. And I was like, that's really interesting. And I'm still not 100% sure why it was a bear I was scared of. There was an interesting split that happens to the cave where actually the point I was sitting at was right before this split of a big natural lava pillar. And so the cave splits in two, but then comes back to join together on the other side. And the thing that was even more interesting to me, so I moved through breathing with the anxiety of like, oh, there could be a bear coming down the right side of this cave, was there was a slight anxiety in wanting to turn my flashlight back on as well. Like, on some level, my system had found comfort or safety in being in that space alone in the dark. And when I went to turn my flashlight back on, again, don't rationally know why this fear came up, but I was scared that there was going to be a large black dragon standing in front of me. There's been other symbolic work for me that has come up around a large black dragon. At that point, I hadn't gone through as much of my processing or found as much of my comfort in working with that symbolic being, creature in my own work. Now she's actually a power totem in the work I do for myself. Anyhow, I eventually turned the light back on. There was no large black dragon physically standing in front of me. And so I decided to leave the cave. There were a few other very interesting things that happened in that experience. And they were all things where like I went down into this space to experience being alone in the dark and came out realizing one of the last things I actually was completely alone in that experience at all. The very last point I will touch on was when I got up to the base of a ladder. So you actually have to kind of climb this rock mound that's at the exit, and there's a small leveled off platform or dirt platform at the top, and then it's about a 10-foot ladder that there's the ladder touches at the ground on the platform, and it touches up at one of the sides towards the top of the ladder, but otherwise it's a vacant void around it. But when I got up to the foot of that ladder, I looked down as there was a piece of garbage on the ground. And this is one of my friend's properties. It is something that, like, it was just like, somebody littered here today, because they do allow um, individual people to hike into the property. They can't drive in, they can't stay at the cabin, things like that. But they are allowed to walk in to do day hikes through the caves and on the property with how the family has it set up. But I saw this piece of garbage and I went, somebody littered. Like, why wouldn't they pick this up? And it was this like red little sandwich bag. And so I was like, I'll pick it up and I'll take it back to the cabin with me and throw it away. And I pick it up and I realized there's a envelope inside of it, and I turned it over and the envelope said, for you. And I literally at that point got a wave of uh, chills that shot through my body. It was also this very high intensity electrical feeling in my body. I don't know how to describe it besides that. Again, it's just the sensations and feelings inside my body coming up at that point in time. And I was like, what the fuck is this? And I slowly opened it because I was like, why is this thing here? Why does it say for you out of all things? And I pulled out this card. And as I pulled it out, the card inside the envelope was completely plain, just brown paper stock. And as I opened it up, inside the top flap, it said breathe, dot, dot, dot. And on the bottom flap, it said, it's going to be okay. And I still am getting like chills up the back of my spine right now as I'm talking about this because it was a really powerful moment to receive. Again, there had been some other things in my life coming up around, um, like I had gone through some extensive breathwork trainings in the last 6 months prior to that. And this idea that breath is life. Like, as much as we need food, we need shelter, we need water, we need clothing, right? That ultimately, like, that highest need on a very physiological level is even breath. Like, if you don't have a breath, like, that is the thing, like, you cannot sustain with for the longest. I think the longest anybody's gone even holding their breath is between 20 and 30 minutes, and that's some professional divers. And so I think you can go a handful of days without drinking water. You can go up to a week, maybe a little bit more without eating food. Same with sleep. It's somewhere between like a few days to a week time span before it starts becoming really detrimental for your health. Um, but then just again, that space of like, I had just been very alone in the dark, and now there's a letter waiting for me that tells me I'm not. um, as I walked back to the cabin, I started having all these flashes in my head, being like, "Oh, my friend dropped it down the ladder. Her mom was the only other person who I had told that knew I was going to have this experience. She probably dropped it down there to like make my experience more magical or mystical or whatever." And I got back and talked to my friend, and she seemed to have no idea about it. And I talked to another one of her friends and mentioned thinking like maybe my friend's mom had dropped it down there. And she's like, "Peh, she wouldn't do something like that. That's not her." I was like, "Oh, that's interesting." Well, by order of coincidence, um, because that is what most people would consider it, and to me, it is a weird sequence of coincidences. During the day before, I ended up finding this out later the next day. My friend's son and daughter had gone and walked down by the cave exit. The daughter had found this card shoved in between some of the posts that create the covering for the cave exit. And they'd looked at it and like taken it out. Well, when she was done with it, because she's like, why would somebody leave this here? Handed it to her younger brother, and him being existentially him and very high boy energy went, "Puh, I'm gonna throw it in the cave." And he literally just tossed it in the cave. He didn't go set it directly at the foot of the ladder. Like, as I had mentioned before, this was a rock mound that you had to climb. Like, and the top of the rock mound is maybe I want to say a tenth to the eighth of the like diameter size of the opening to the exit of the cave. So for the fact of where that card even landed, like, the coincidence is weird in my head because it literally could have gone down any of the sides of the mounds. I never would have found it or seen it, and it wouldn't have been there, right? Let alone that this little boy didn't go, "Oh, I'm going to take it back to the house and go throw it away." he decided, I'm gonna throw it in the cave. Or that we had seen at least 5 to 6 other groups of hikers walk in to go to the caves during the day. I went on my cave journey during the middle of the night. So this was after anybody else was in that area for public use, but nobody else had happened to find it or think, I'm going to pick up a piece of garbage somebody left behind in this space. And I guess even on that extent, that I decided to do that because so many times we walk past a piece of garbage and don't think twice about it, right? And those are the spaces where it's like we'll relate it to coincidence a lot of the time, but maybe it's not. Maybe coincidence is a little bit more rare than we give it credit for, also in some extents, because for whatever reason those were the exact words I needed to hear when I was going through a journey that was literally aimed at me feeling incredibly alone and in the dark. And I guess I want to get more into the light side of feeling alone because there can be a really big dualism that pops up. And I want to say, I feel like a master of dualism at this point with how much I notice it within my own life, or duality, right? The feelings of light versus dark, yin yang, masculine, feminine, even when it comes to like this topic of alone, like there's the scary side of alone, and there is also the immense joy and bliss that can come from being alone. So moving into this side of like joy and bliss, and it's finding the balances that work for us. But one thing I've noticed is, so let's say when I'm in relationships with other people, I will hit points where I feel overwhelmed by the amount of contact I'm actually having with other individuals. I will feel suffocated, trapped in boxes. I will um, feel like I'm losing myself in different degrees. And this doesn't always have to be in toxic relationships. Did it mainly show up and like for where I started noticing it within toxic relationships? Yes, very much so. Those have been some of my personal, like, biggest moments of realizing how much I was giving myself over, how much responsibility I was taking for other people. But again, there is that space of, oh, but when I'm alone, I can just be me, right? And I can almost come back to my baseline of just being me, or me as my normal. So I can kind of check in with myself. And that is where I find some of the greatest value in my alone time, because I know I have patterns in my past of kind of chameleoning myself to suit the people around me. And when I do that, I can start to forget my normal self, my normal form, my authentic self, my core self, like the person I love and want to be. And I can lose that because on some level there's a part of me that wants to perform and be this thing that makes other people happy as well. And again, there's nothing wrong with either of those parts showing up. It's just not going so heavily into getting lost in relationships that I lose who I am. Because I've done that. I've done that as well. And when I did that, I ultimately turned myself into someone I didn't like. And on top of that, it didn't seem to matter how much I changed or how much I shifted to meet the ideals of this other person, they didn't like me either, right? It didn't matter how much I did to try to make them happy. Ultimately, I can't make anyone else happy. And that has been a hard lesson I've tried to learn over the last 6 years since I became cognizant of it. But ultimately, it came down to it did not matter how much I tried to make other people happy. If other people were going to be happy, like they were gonna be, they were going to make the choice to be, they were going to do their own work and find their own satiation, gratitude, things like that. That's not something that most people just know how to do. Like, I mean, it is. When we're first born, we all know how to do that, right? But it is a skill set to do that consciously. It is a skill set to do that regularly, right? If you get in a mode with a little kid where you're constantly just giving them everything and they don't have any amount of responsibility for what they're getting, they don't have any gratitude for what they're giving, you end up inducing levels of entitlement. And the same thing goes for adults. My role in my very codependent relationships was that I would just do all the things. And a lot of that was without any form of gratitude or appreciation. And I don't expect that. Like I try to enter relationships not expecting there to need to be gratitude or appreciation, right? I don't expect that unless somebody agrees that they're going to pay me for something that I'm going to necessarily receive anything from them. But one of the big things I had to also learn about being in relationships was if I'm in places where I'm giving, right? If I'm in places where I'm doing for others, to allow the spaces of that to come back. And if I'm in those kind of relationships where I'm constantly giving and another person is like happy to take, right? But two, not giving back, or three, acting entitled that I need to do that thing for them always, that it wasn't just a gift. Now that is a big sign for me to take a step back, to start giving to myself a little bit more, over giving to other people. Um, Also that, like, yes, there's if I want a relationship where it's just me giving and I'm happy with that space, cool. But like, let me be cognizant of that. Let me have a layer of consciousness and choice in that versus having this underlying expectation or underlying need that this person B may consider me their best friend. I may not consider them my best friend because they may be receiving from me a certain holding of space, a certain level of compassion, right? That they don't know how to give back. Or maybe they know how to give it back, but they're only giving it out in other areas. So for me, that's there are signals for me to take those step back, to give myself a little bit more of that alone time, that focus on me, to recognize what my needs are, because I've also recognized I can end up losing myself in that space of giving. I love giving. I love giving to other people. It is really, really fulfilling for my nervous system. It is also a trauma response and a survival instinct that I adapted from a very young age. And it can also be really uncomfortable for me to receive. And again, it's where I like playing with edges. Me even being willing to grant myself alone space when somebody else wants time with me can be difficult for me to express because, again, that's coming back to me stating what my needs are. And there's no me having to fight for what those needs are, right? As long as, like, if it is something I can fulfill myself, I don't need to explain, excuse, give reasons, or be in a conflict that that need is okay. And when you get more comfortable with giving yourself alone space, or at least for me, when I got more comfortable with giving myself that alone space is where I realized, oh, I don't I don't have to fight for these things. I can ask others for them. If they can't fulfill them, that's okay. I'll find other ways to get them fulfilled. Or I can fulfill them myself. What do I need for myself to be able to do that? Oh, I need alone time? Cool. I can do that. And it's figuring out that balance between you're alone and you're social, or you're alone and you're couple, or whatever that looks like for you, because this doesn't have to just come down to partnered relationships, right? There's family dynamics, there's peer dynamics, there's work dynamics. Like for me, in a work environment, I work really well in groups. I also work really well alone, and I can get things done typically on a faster level if I do them alone. I was very, very high productivity employee when I was working for corporations and in those spaces. At the same time, there is a different level of creativity and productivity that comes out of me when I work with group spaces. So again, it's finding how you thrive in different environments and moving through the space of, like, again, being scared to do it alone. One of my favorite speakers I used to listen to regularly was this man named Terrence McKenna, and he is passed now, but he was a huge part of the psychedelic movement and exploring with psychedelics on his own, and he wrote quite a few books on the topic. But I remember coming across one of the lectures they have posted of his on YouTube, and he's talking about psychedelics, but he's referencing, like, be willing to go it alone. And so many of us can get stuck in these cycles of being scared to do that. And that it doesn't just apply to psychedelics. I mean, some people can get too scared to go on a trip to the beach by themselves, to say, you know what, like, I really want to go put my toes in the ocean. Like, I'm gonna pack up my car and go to the beach today, right? Taking themselves out on a date. You don't actually need another person there to have the experience of a date. One of my highest recommendations for anyone out there looking at dating is, if you want to start dating yourself first. What would you want to be experiencing? What would you want to be exploring? Where would you want to go? Loving themselves. That was another narrative that I didn't think I could get alone. I did not think, for some reason, even though there is all the world of self help and self love touted, right? I was not actually aware that, like, I could be loved, feel loved, have love completely alone. And when I would feel those things when I was alone, because I had always related it to somebody else being there, I didn't realize that that was a thing that I was even feeling and experiencing in having when I was solo. I mean, I had many times where I was single, and again, like, I went through strings of relationships where I was only having, like, 6-month gaps between big long-term relationships. Um, but in those times, I think the longest I went was, like, a year and a half at points, which was great. I loved that space, and I loved that in that space, I made a commitment to myself to not become anybody's girlfriend or partner as well, because I had plenty of people come up to me and be like that I was hanging out with just here and there, being like, "I wanna be your boyfriend." I was like, "I don't wanna be anybody's girlfriend. That's not a thing right now. We can be friends, we can hang out." But I even recognized then this over responsibility that I took in becoming, taking on that label of being somebody's girlfriend, somebody's partner, and I would start to lose myself more and more quickly as I went down that rabbit hole of the relationship. I would lose myself to the relationship. Let's see, what else do I want to touch on? I don't know. I guess there's a lot of value in finding your peace in being alone. And I think we're really good at getting caught up in what it means if we are alone, and especially women. Women get a lot more of that. I want to say that I've seen in social dynamics. There's a lot more pressure on women to start families and have kids and get married. Um, I mean, I definitely dealt with that as far as input of having my peers, coworkers through my 20s and early 30s asking when I was going to get married, when somebody was going to get me to settle down and have kids and all these things. And I'm sure that men experience that to some degree as well, but there is also the the fertility window of women where it becomes this much more high pressure phase of our lifespan because women are only fertile for a chunk of their life. And males, pretty much as soon as they hit puberty and start producing semen, can then procreate through any age of life. Once they start that cycle, it does not stop until they are dead, respectively. Um, so while there can be similarities there, I do want to say like there is more pressure that gets put on women in that realm. And also this pressure that gets put on value being added from a certain person based on their age and desirability as a man. I feel like I'm getting off topic right now, getting away from the alone. But the premise is that like, I mean, it wasn't all that long ago that women were referred to as like spinsters if they were past the age of 25 and had not been married or started building a family of their own as of yet. And so there are dynamics where women have definitely dealt with a much higher level of shame when it comes to them wanting to be alone or them hitting phases of their life of being alone. There was also much higher restrictions and limits to women being able to do that. And there is still some reflection of that in our society, with there still being slight wage gaps for males versus females in the exact same types of roles or in roles that are have a similar value point to them. Um, there are a lot of roles that get leaned towards like more females being employed in them that are very high value roles. Our society would not function without them, that I personally consider incredibly underpaid. And where I consider them incredibly underpaid was based on me having worked in massage therapy. And I worked on a large variety of people's bodies in spa settings and um, therapeutic settings, working at a chiropractor's office. Obviously, there's only a subset of the population who feels drawn to go to a chiropractic office at all, is open to getting a massage, has the resources or insurance to be able to provide that. But what I tended to find was the people who came in to get a massage that typically had the most tension held in their body. And I worked on physical laborers, I worked on people who worked in offices. Again, it was a very wide scope of people and different career points that they worked through. Um, was dental assistants and medical assistants or nurses. And on an emotional level, like, I don't know the level of stress that they're holding or dealing with on a daily basis. What I can tell you from that view as a massage therapist, those were the two people who would come in and their bodies would be wrecked. And I want to say, guessing numbers for my life, I'm going to say 95% of the people who I have met that fall into either one of those fields are female that I worked in through massage or have met at other points in my life. And their jobs are intensive. Their jobs are not easy. Again, it's a difference in how society puts value on certain roles. We can get into a whole talk on how we place values as humans and what creates value, and it really is all just a whole lot of human construct for how we place those things. And as we get into creating that value, one, realize like you help create that value. Like what you find worth investing in becomes valuable to you. If you want to invest in yourself, in your alone time, in your self love, because you can have love, you can have the most immense love you have ever experienced in your life just from you. Like, you can place your value there. And there is nothing wrong with that. And the more you start doing that, the more you start seeing that value being in you, the more you'll start wondering why you didn't see it before. And the more things in your world will start reflecting that you are valuable and worthy. I do want to clarify, like, let's stay out of the realm of like going into individual God modes. And where I say that is you will have people go into an ego trip with finding their value, to where now them finding their value says, I'm the most valuable thing in the world. I'm more valuable than anything, anyone else. I'm more powerful. It's where you get the people like who go crazy and they're like, I'm a golden god. Yes, you are a fucking golden god, but every single other person on the planet is also a golden god. Oh, and that amoeba that's living under a fucking rock is also a golden god. Like they're all the things are actually equal. Like the piece of dirt has immense value, as well as the elephant, as well as the human, as well as the sentient beings. It's recognizing that you have value within that system as well. It's recognizing that whether in a relationship or being alone. There is immense value there. When you get into the realms of shadow work, which is also for me one of those big spaces that relates to this topic of alone, because for so long I thought I was alone. And then I got into shadow work and aspecting work, working with parts. If you're curious about understanding more about what I'm talking about right now, look at IFS therapy, internal family systems, and it helps delineate it a little bit better so I don't have to spend an hour explaining it here. But you start to realize that even when you are alone, like me sitting in that big dark cave, right? You're never actually 100% alone. Um, there are different parts and pieces of you, kind of like different personalities that exist within you. There are all the reflections of the world around you. Even like if you're feeling exiled and everything from a group, like there are people around you. Um, I think some of my biggest reflections that go back to what comes up as the feelings of loneliness, because I will tell you that no matter the relationship I have been in my life, there has been significant points where, while in partnered relationships, even some friendship relationships, definitely family relationships, I have felt more alone, more lonely than I ever have when I've physically been alone. And what that breaks down to for me is core needs on a very emotional, social basis, which come down to the space of feeling seen, of feeling heard, accepted, understood, and loved. And that is literally the core foundation of the work I do with clients, is allowing them that space to not only feel seen and heard by me, but to start witnessing that within themselves. And then you learn, like, we work through the acceptance of those spaces, that there's this part of this that feels so angry when other people blame us for them not being happy, right? That's the acceptance, is just acknowledging that it's there, that it exists. Understanding is the point. It's not agreeing. It's not saying, well, you're right for like being angry with this, right? Understanding is just understanding that, like, yeah, it's probably really hard when people like get upset with you or blame you for them not being happy. And then love is coming back to a place of deep compassion, of kindness, of holding, not then going back and berating that part of you that feels angry. And so that core foundation is you're building a community inside yourself with these different parts, with these different aspects, ultimately to try, not forcing it, try, right? But actually building a relationship through your own system and building a community within you. And honestly, like, that has been some of the most fulfilling work I ever did, because ultimately I would put this need of wanting to be seen, heard, understood, accepted, and loved out on my relationships around me. and I couldn't find it. Like, I would get little tastes of it, I would get breadcrumbs, I would get, like, just the tiniest little niblet of it, and I'm like, "Oh, this is it, I'm getting to have this feeling. Yes!" Right? And then because of my other behaviors and patterns and relationships, I was never fully getting to have that and experience it. And it was so hard and it was so heartbreaking because it fed back into the other narratives of, like, I'm not enough, I'm not lovable, like, I can't be trusted, all these other terrible things I tell myself on a regular basis. I mean, I've had some of them flashing recently, and it's a deeper reflection of my old patterns, right? That's like, well, you're not a good mom, and you're a terrible business owner, and what are you creating? You can't create shit. Like, you're not doing enough, you're not earning enough, you're not being enough. All these things, and they're not even necessarily things people in the world are telling me. There's every once in a while that comes in, but I also don't have to take on those things from the world around me. They're When I do hear those things from the world around me, though, and my nervous system holds on to it, like, I keep hearing their voice telling me that, or I stay fixated on whatever it was they were saying, there's a very high likelihood that some part of my nervous system believes that is true. And then it is this beautiful part for me to get to work with in building my internal community. And I will tell you, there was a point in time a few years ago where I was talking to my mom about this idea of parts work and aspecting work. And I was fascinated and just mind blown that, like, I was coming across all these parts and how unique each of them were in their character. And, like, it still baffles me because it's like its whole own world inside there. And this doesn't just exist within me, it exists within many people. And honestly, like, when I started researching this more and doing that sort of work for myself, it had me realize, people who have been diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder, I do not believe it is called that anymore. For a long time, it was referred to as multiple personalities disorder. How that exists within each and every one of us. And theirs is just a further extreme of how their parts had to fragment to try to keep them safe and help them survive. But I mean, I know that I have had the experience of getting really angry and things just kind of shoot out of my mouth. And it's not that they're inaccurate, they may be brought to a bigger extreme or a bigger pain point than they actually are because it is built up with so much pressure. But, like, there's no controlling it. And that's kind of that idea with dissociative identity disorder, where people have all these different identities that pop. It's just they're not usually cognizant that they exist, or at least, like, the main personality, the main self is not, but the other personalities can also be aware of one another because they are usually there to protect the core being, the authentic self. But anyway, back to what I was saying before. I got highly fascinated. I know I am a little scattered on today's call because there's so many different avenues that flow into this concept of being alone for me. Um, I was telling my mom about that sort of work, and she's like, "Oh yeah, I remember, like, back in the 80s I read a book on that, and there's like 12. There's 12 personalities that are in there." And I looked at her and I just got this big grin on my face and started, like, kind of giggling. And I was like, "Oh, there's thousands. Like, it might be a whole world in there. It's not just 12. Like, you can come across probably countless inner wounded children, right? A different angry part that gets flared for different things, different sad parts, different parts that have felt heartbreak or loss for different reasons, different parts of you that get quiet during different scenarios, and you can lump them all into one group, or you can not. You can, if they feel like different pieces, if they show up with different characters, with different sensations in your body, then it's likely that they can be different parts. And there's no rights or wrongs for the way that you identify those. It's also getting to recognize that, like, as you identify those out, you're not alone. You got whole communities within you. And as much as you have like these wounded or these exiles or like judgy parts and the inner critic and all these things, you also have amazingly empowered pieces that exist within you. So, and I guess that kind of brings it back around from the topic of the cave journey earlier, because I mentioned being scared there was going to be a large black dragon sitting in front of me. And like I can still flash back to the image that I had of what it was going to look like when I turned on my flashlight, seeing this large black dragon with her head like haunched right in my face in front of me. And I can imagine that in better detail. I can recall that image in my mind in better detail than if I try to bring up a picture of my own face. I find that interesting because a lot of those imaginal spaces I have a better memory recall on than everyday life images. Um, but she ended up being, this dragon has ended up being one of my very empowered parts that was very related to the darkness. And that can be considered dark goddess energy. That was mainly how I was introduced to it myself. Um, but there's lots of ways to go about that. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of technical issues with. There we go. Got it sorted. Anyhow, I guess the point is like, in all the ways that we can feel alone, because that could be really happy for you, it could be really scary for you, it could be sad, it could be ecstatic, it could be calm, it could be full of energy. Like, there's no rights or wrongs. The thing is, just recognizing you can experience such a variety of things in being alone. There can be really high value points in being alone. Even getting to play with the space of like forcing yourself to be alone for a point in time, right? Can be high value on its own. You don't have to do that. Again, it's these things that a part of you feels called to explore. And you are the only person who's ever going to know what those things are for you to explore. You can invite other people along for that journey with you, kind of like that idea of dating yourself. But what happens when you invite somebody else out on a date and they don't show up? And then you're left at the date location on your own. Are you now gonna like mope and get sad about it and go home? I've been that person. I've done that. And then I felt rejected and I was like, what's wrong with me? And got into all those narratives. And at some point, when I decided, you know what, I'm willing to go it alone on some level, I went, oh, well, I'm just going to do the thing myself still. I wanted to experience this thing anyway. I don't have to have somebody else right here to be able to experience it. And yes, is it great to have that as just shared space? Fuck yes. I have also had another person being in a shared space with me for an experience kind of muck it up because they get in their negative feelings about it. And then on some level, it can become less enjoyable, right? Especially if they're just complaining about the thing the whole time. I get to deal with that on a somewhat regular basis, having a young child, and like I'll wake up and I'll be all like chipper and happy for the day, and that day he happens to be kind of a grump. And like it can get hard for me to stay in the happy and chipper, especially when somebody's getting more grumpy because I'm happy and chipper. And I do my best to not let that impact me, but there are points where it still does. And so those are even times where it's like, oh, well, you don't really want to be here doing this thing. Like, you do your thing, I'll do my thing. And with a young child, it's a little bit different, but I still create that space for myself. If he doesn't really want to be doing the thing, I don't want to make him do the thing. I don't want that extra argument. But then he can take care of whatever he's wanting to do himself. Same with a partner, same with a friend, same with a family member. So be willing to take the risk to do it alone. If you're real comfy doing it alone, be willing to take the risk to try it with somebody else too. I like pushing edges. And I hope that if you're here and you've listened to this whole thing, that you are willing to push your own edges as well, because there's value in it. It's how we grow, it's how we learn, it's how we create new memories through adding novelty, to adding new experiences of things that could be. All right, that's it for today. If you're interested in working with me and exploring your own shadows, your own community within yourself, finding immense layers of self love, self worth, right? Then you can go under the description on YouTube and you will find links for resources. There is also free email lists that you can hop on through there that have some amazing information and offers free practices, things along those lines. I also want to invite everyone to come back next week where we will be joined by another coach, Heather Nicole Fritz. She has been a dear friend of mine for the last handful of years, and she runs a company called Taboo Soul. And our topic next week is, in fact, taboo. Uh, when feeling bad feels so good. All right, that's it. Have a good one.